Let's begin reading now as we close out the first chapter of Revelation with verses 17 through 20. And it says, when I saw him, we've been talking about the wonderful things that John saw when he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Well, when he saw Jesus, he says, I fell at his feet as though dead. And I think it was the Message translation that says, I fainted dead away. Wow, that's very graphic, and that seems to be a good description. He was overwhelmed, fell at his feet as though dead, and then he says he placed his right hand. Remember, that's the right hand is the strong hand of blessing. He placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I'm the first and the last. I'm the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades, or death and hell, some versions say. And then verse 19, write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and of the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and we'll explain that before the message is over. And the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but a good thing for you to know at this point in our series of messages is that verse 19 is a very simple 3-part outline of the book of Revelation. So, verse 19 says, I want you to write about what you have seen. That is mostly what we've been looking at in the first chapter. Those wonderful things that John saw and the significance of every detail, the golden lampstands and the glorious figure of Christ. So, what you have seen is found in chapter 1. But then those next words that are our focus for today, what is now? It's not a question, what is now? It's a statement of things as they are right now. What is now? And God puts a focus on that. That's going to be our focus today. And then that's basically going to be found in chapters 2 and 3. What's going on in those 7 churches that relates to our church, every single one to some degree. And then finally, the last thing there is what will take place later is basically what is covered in chapters 4 through 22. So hopefully that helps a little bit to make this somewhat mysterious book a little more comprehensible. So we've been dealing with the things John saw in chapter 1, and to some extent, the things that are happening now in 95 AD. We've already seen that the 7 churches were hurting. They were in trouble. They were under an impossible demand from Rome's emperor that everybody in the Roman Empire had to worship the emperor, had to burn a pinch of incense and say Caesar is Lord. And so we've seen that in the now, they're in a very, very tough spot. And we've seen that in the now, John is in a tough spot. He's on that island. And so we've looked at the islands, or at the churches, and their difficulties, and some of John's difficulties on that island, separated from the people he loves so much. But I want us to go deeper on that expression, what is now, and see that everything that affected everybody who's addressed in this letter, God had known about it for hundreds of years, thousands of years. God knew so far in advance because He's omniscient. He knows everything. And He knew exactly what they would be dealing with in the now of this year, 95 AD. And in the process of doing that, I hope that at least a couple of things will come to pass. One of them, we'll understand how God's been preparing an answer for them for a long, long time. And the other thing, if God knew everything about the now that those precious, persecuted, beleaguered believers were going through, He knows what you're going through. He knows your now. If He knew the year 95 AD all over the empire and how it was affecting every one of His children, He knows your now. Right now. He saw it ahead of time. And so let's begin to look at some of the things that make it so clear that God was ready for this time. A few Sundays ago, I had a rare bout with some stomach distress that would not let me be in the pulpit. I can't even remember a time before that when that's happened in memory of years. But it happened that Sunday, and Brother Hopkins filled this pulpit on my behalf, and he spoke to you about the punctuality of God, and he asked the question occasionally in that sermon, was God on time? Is He always on time? And that's a good thought that ties in so well with the message today as we begin to look at some of the things in the now in which this book is going forth that show how God specifically designed this book to go forth at this time to meet needs at that time. So the map will help to clarify for you that, number one thing that God foresaw a long time ago, and that is that Ephesus would have a major harbor where the biggest ships that sailed the Mediterranean Sea would be able, and if you're looking at your map, John's on the Isle of Patmos, and then we've drawn little lines with arrows to show where, when the boat with that book that we're studying left the Isle of Patmos, it sailed to and around a little larger island just below a big island called Samos, and then the boat turned to the right and went to the north side of that big island of Samos, and it headed for a natural harbor at Ephesus. But for a long, long time, for hundreds of years, Rome had been improving that harbor because it was the gateway to a whole bunch of cities, including 7 that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks. And so, do you know, Rome had a corps of engineers. It didn't go by that name, but it was the same as the Army's Corps of Engineers today. They had people that if Caesar wanted to go through a swampy area, they could build a bridge through it. If Caesar needed his soldiers to have roads between cities, he set them to doing it. And if it took 100 years, how many of you have had a slowdown on Interstate 40 in the last few weeks? In the last few months? In the last few years? Yes. So Rome didn't care how long it took. They had the engineers, they had the soldiers, they had the workers, and they collected the taxes to make it happen. So Rome had improved that harbor. They had kept dredging it out. There was a major river called the Caister River that flowed down and dumped its water right in that harbor at Ephesus. And so Rome was constantly dredging out the silt and keeping that harbor great. And it had never been such a perfect harbor as it was at this time. 100 years of Roman work had been going on. And so when that ship that was a part of God's plan carried that letter with somebody who's responsible for delivering that letter, and it takes it to the harbor in Ephesus, God knew that harbor would be ready at this time, in that now. What is now is that God has a harbor to start the journey of that letter called what we call the book of Revelation. What he also knew was that as time went on and Rome's power weakened, the dredging would slow down and the silt would take over. And I'm told that by today from Ephesus, where you used to be able to walk down to the docks and greet the ships and take the letters or the visitors that you were waiting on, it's at least 6 miles before you can get to the sea. The river has filled that area in, and eventually it ceased to be a significant harbor at all, and the whole city went down. It was the leading city, perhaps, of Asia at that time. And so God saw, right now, I've got a harbor. Sometime in the future won't work. That harbor won't even be there. That city won't be a great center. But for right now, God had a harbor, and that was a big part of His plan. And then the second thing was that God saw that He had a universal language at that time. And that was important because Jesus and His disciples who became apostles, like John, I don't know if you knew this, they were exposed to 4 languages in their daily lives. And that was pretty common as kingdoms overlapped with kingdoms, and over time, different languages became part of the culture. I had a medical doctor that went to the church I pastored for 3 months in Ethiopia, and he and his family became good friends. And so had a delightful meal in their home one time, and this doctor and I just clicked, and we had some great conversations. And so one time he said, "Pastor John, do you know what they call people who can speak 3 languages?" And I said, "Yep, I think that would be trilingual." He said, Good, Pastor John. Do you know what they call somebody who speaks 2 languages? And I said, "Well, yeah, that's even more common. That's bilingual." He said, "Okay, good, Pastor John. Do you know what they call somebody who speaks only 1 language?" I said, "You got me there." He said, "Americans." So that kind of stuck with me. And so in the day in which Jesus was growing up in Nazareth, they had 3 other languages beside Greek. They had Hebrew, which was, some would call, the ancient holy language in which the 10 Commandments were given, and the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those early books were all written in Hebrew. But the thing is, if you weren't a Jew, you didn't know Hebrew. Hardly anybody else in the world was willing to learn it, and they didn't have to learn it, and it was hard, and they didn't learn it. In fact, it was so hard that in Bible school I thought, I don't have time to learn anything about Hebrew and Greek at the same time. Greek's the language of the New Testament, and I'll just have to trust books to tell me what the Hebrew says. So Hebrew was in their daily lives. It was the original language of the Old Testament. But then there was also Aramaic, which was a daily but dying language. That was probably the primary language in Jesus' home when He was growing up in the Galilee area. It was an area that was slower to change than the big city area down around Jerusalem. And so Aramaic was an important language, but it was dying. God knew that by 95 A.D., there wouldn't be very many people in the world speaking Aramaic, and hardly any of them outside of Palestine. So Aramaic wasn't going to be a good choice. And then you had Latin, because the Romans ruled the world. And they had a great language for talking about soldiers and government, and it was a very practical language. But there was a 4th language, and it was Greek. And remember hearing in years in church, you've heard about the Babylonian captivity, and when God's holy people were scattered in that Babylonian captivity, what was the language that was beginning to take over the world, it was Greek. And so 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And that's called the Septuagint, which is based on a word for seven. And so, you know what I found out this last week? I keep finding out stuff right now. I'm 82 and a half years of age. This is my 60th year of full-time gospel ministry, preaching the Word. And I love studying, but you can't ever get to the bottom of this book called the Bible. And so, just this past 2 weeks, I dug up the fact that Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which was all the scriptures they had when Jesus was growing up as a good synagogue boy, as were Matthew and Mark and John and all the others. What do you think was the language they were reading when Jesus had that scroll handed him? It was Greek, because by that time, the Septuagint, Greek version of the Bible that was going to be the language that took over the world, when they handed the Scripture to Jesus and he said, he read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has anointed me." Every word of it was in Greek. And so Jesus grew up as a quadrilingual person. He was exposed to Hebrew and Aramaic and to a little bit to Latin, but Greek was the language that God saw when Jesus was born. Jesus saw in 95 AD in the eternal counsels of God, God saw a universal language, and it was a language that was adequate for Greek philosophers and people who were wanting to be really precise in what they were saying. And so when you hear somebody say, well, the oldest Greek manuscripts say such and such, you know, every one of those guys that grew up in those synagogues, they grew up having a working knowledge of Greek, and when the Holy Spirit inspired them, write down what it was like to spend 3.5 years with Jesus, everyone was written in Greek. Every letter that Paul wrote was written in Greek. And you say, well, why is that important? Because Greek was so much better suited than any other language. And I wanted to give you a reference without reading from it. But you remember when Jesus was reinstating Peter in John 21, 15 through 17, he uses 2 different words for love to find out how much Peter loves him. He used 2 different words for sheep, big ones and little ones, so that shepherds of God's flock would know, you got to think about the folks. What are they ready for? What does this one need and what does this one need? So there's 2 words for love, 2 words for sheep, and 2 words for taking care of them. One of them more focused on what you feed them, and the other is how you help them get well, how you help them get through difficult times in their lives. And so God saw that in this time, this period of time, He had a great harbor at Ephesus. He had a great language for the whole world to hear that Jesus was Lord and King of Kings, and however tough things are, Jesus is on the throne, and the whole world could understand this book because of that. And then the third thing, you notice on this map that once they got to Ephesus, I haven't really tried to put a ruler to it, but it looks like that the journey between Ephesus and Smyrna was probably 25 or 30 miles. Maybe Smyrna to Pergamum might have been 75 or even closer to 100 miles, and then each journey was a little different. But every mile of the way there was a Roman road. And I told you about those roads that might take 100 years. This road to connect these 7 cities took easily 100 years. It even beat the record of the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. Well, so far at least. So far, at least, that is true. And so it was important. They had a road that those Roman engineers had designed and the Roman construction crews had built. And God knew that would make it possible for them as long as they didn't get beat up by robbers along the way. But then there was a further thing that Rome was noted for. They were tough about law and order, and they had soldiers patrolling those roads. The world had never seen anything like it. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And so basically, you could make that journey of several hundred miles connecting all those cities, and you didn't have to take a bunch of security guys on fast camels to protect you and to chase down robbers. And so God had a great harbor, and He had a great language, and He had great roads, and He had a great system of peace and law and order as Roman soldiers patrolled the roads. And it brings us to thinking that what Galatians 4:4 said, that when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son. And that ties in with what Brother Hopkins was preaching to you about a few weeks ago. When the fullness of time, when God saw everything coming together, and this is when it needs to happen. This is when those churches will be on the ropes, their backs to the wall, afraid for their lives. John grieving because he's separated from the congregation that he's primary connected with at Ephesus and those other 6 that he is responsible for. But God saw all of that. But in the fullness of time, God would have what He needed to get His Word, which would not return unto Him void, but would accomplish what He sent it to accomplish. People without hope, their hopes would be revived. People who didn't have a prayer would suddenly realize prayer changes things. Our pastor John was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and God gave him a revelation of Jesus that was so mighty that it changed everything for him, and it changes everything for every one of those churches. And those who will hear this word and take it to heart and put it into practice as it applies to them and their family and their church, they'll be blessed, they'll be blessed, they'll be blessed. And so, in the fullness of time, God saw everything that was going to be going on in your life and my life right now. He saw the challenges. And my kindergarten teacher said I was a highly verbal child. In fact, so much so that it affected my conduct grades. He said, John wiggles a lot and he talks too much. And so God said, I can use that. I can use that energy. I can use that liking to talk and liking words. And so God sees everything from eternity. He sees today just like He did AD 95, just like He saw day 1 when He spoke worlds into existence. And do you know there was never a time when God saw what was happening on earth and said, whoa, I didn't see that one coming. Never once. He always saw it coming. He saw it forever, and He's been preparing for it. So I like talking to folks. And I occasionally hear people say, if I knew I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself. And, this isn't particularly easy right now, where I'm at in life right now. Some parts of it I don't like real well, but you know what? God knows about that. What is now, on this day in 2024, God saw it coming. He knows where you are. He knows where I am. He knows where our church is. He knows where we're going. And so it's the fullness of time. It's always the fullness of time in terms of God's knowing where we're at and what's going on. But there was one other thing that God saw, and that was that along with all these infrastructure things that were so important in His timing, the roads, the peace, the language, and the harbor, and yet perhaps the most critical thing is that God saw that at this moment in time, He had a man on his face before God. And he wasn't any spring chicken, people. He was 95 years of age, but God had kept him alive because God had something for him to do. And you may be here in this auditorium, you may be up in Fairview, you may be out in Kentucky, Washington State, or someplace else watching this service and hearing this message. But God is in control. God is in control, but what He needs is a man or a woman on their face before God. John fell on his knees and cried, "Holy." John was overwhelmed by Jesus, and that changed everything. In every difficult time in history, the turning point has been some little ladies in Scotland praying through the night, beseeching God for revival. People in Topeka, Kansas, people in Los Angeles, California in the early part of the 20th century praying, God, we've been reading the book of Acts and we're praying, can you do it again? We need you to intervene. We need you to step into our time, this time, now. We need you to do something, God. And so God had a man on his face before God. He'd been in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. He'd been praying, and God is ready to work. It's so much like the experience that Daniel had that we read about in Daniel 10. Verse 15 to 19 in the New Living says, while he was speaking to me, I looked down at the ground, unable to say a word, speechless before God. Then the one who looked like a man, he looked like humans, he looked like me, but he was far more than that, but he looked like a man, and he touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. And I said to the one standing in front of me, I'm filled with anguish because of the vision I've seen. In other words, I'm embarrassed by my humanity, my weakness. My Lord, and I'm very weak. But how can someone like me, your servant, talk to you, my Lord? My strength is gone. How long since you've been wiped out by God and just overwhelmed and carried away with Him? My strength is gone. I can hardly breathe. What a great thing to be breathless and speechless at the majesty and the grandeur of God. And we've been singing about that. Some of our worship time today. How great Thou art, how great Thou art. And then he says, then the one who looked like a man touched me again, and I felt my strength returning. Don't be afraid, he said, for you're very precious to God. And I want to just stop there and say, there's things that most of us could be afraid of, about finances, about health, about relationship, about something. But God is saying to us, don't be afraid. Look at me until you see me and hear me and know that you are very precious to me. That's an incredible thing for God to break through our humility and our weakness and say, don't be afraid. You're very precious to God. Peace. Be encouraged. Be strong. And these words, I pray, are coming off the pages of God's Word, out of this preacher's mouth, and finding a place in your heart where you're beginning to say, then I'm not going to be afraid, and I'm going to accept if God says I'm precious to Him. I don't care what the devil says. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what my body says when I wake up at 3 in the morning or later in the day, ready to hit the floor. I don't care. If God says I'm strong and I'm precious to Him, it is true. And we accept it. And so Daniel is encouraged and he's strengthened, and he says, as he spoke these words to me, I suddenly felt stronger, and that's what I've been praying all week. Lord, let your people begin to feel stronger and to feel encouraged and to feel like traveling on no matter what, and just to be so carried away with Jesus that it changes everything. Isaiah 6, Isaiah had a similar experience. Verses 1 and 5 say, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and His train filled the temple. And then down to verse 5, then said I, woe is me, for I'm undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And you know what God brought to my attention as I was meditating on that encounter that Isaiah had with this high and holy and majestic and loving God. And that is that, have you ever noticed there? It was in the year that King Uzziah died that I saw the Lord sitting on the throne. And I feel like God put a word in my heart, and I hope you can receive it, but I think it is a word from God that if we're not careful, when times are tough and division is great and feelings run high, it is pretty easy to get too much emphasis on somebody other than Jesus. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord, and He was high and lifted up, and His train filled the temple. And so I really think this time, something like 9 days before an election, that's got a lot of anxiety going in a lot of people, because basically half the country is going to be upset and feel let down and despondent the day after the election. And yet, if we get it in mind, God said, have no other gods before Him. Put Jesus on the throne. Have the people that you care about and you work for, you send money for, but don't put anybody but Jesus on the throne. In the year that other gods die, we can see Jesus high and lifted up. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to care, but it means that we need to care more about Jesus and hear Him say, don't be afraid. People, don't be afraid of the donkey. Don't be afraid of the elephant. Get your eyes on the Lamb and believe that He will still be the King of Kings. He will, in fact, I think there's never been a more relevant song than get all excited and go tell everybody that Jesus Christ is King. Jesus Christ is still the King of Kings. He's still the King today. He'll still be the King next year. He'll still be the King in January, forever and ever and ever. Jesus is the King. And so just make sure that He gets top billing in your life, in our hearts, and everything else will fall into place. Now, were the people upset about what was happening in Rome and the things the emperor was putting on them? Of course, and it was reasonable, and yet God said they need a real strong shot of Jesus. They need to see Him high and lifted up and be as overwhelmed as John is as he lies on his face before the Lord. And I've just been, even before Kenny shared with me, God had been leading him to draw closer to the Lord, to get deeper into Him. He's been talking to me that way too, and saying we need some times when not only is our doctrine correct, but as we're going to see in some of these letters, your doctrine can be correct, but it can be dead. And so Jesus wants us to be on fire for Him. He wants us to be filled with an excitement in our love for Jesus as never before. But I'm starting to get into next week's sermon, so I'm going to stop right now. I'm looking forward to getting into that Ephesian letter.